Respected seniors, teachers, faculty members, and delegates. Greetings from IAP Neocon 2021. I am Dr. Rajagopalan, Coordinator IAP Neocon 2021. Let us start the 16th webinar of Learn from the Legends, International Bi-Monthly Webinar Series, an academic initiative of IAP NeoChap, organized by NNF Kerala and IAP Thrissur. We have nearly 3,500 registrations from 70 countries for this scientific feast. A warm welcome to all delegates in Zoom as well as YouTube on behalf of IAP NeoChap for today's program. Today, we have an eminent faculty, Professor Dr. Gautam Suresh, Children's Hospital, Houston, Texas, to address an important topic, patient safety in NICU, a five-pronged approach. We welcome you, sir, for the webinar. Two senior experts in neonatology of our country are moderators for today's session. Professor Dr. Somashekar Nimbalkar from Gujarat and Professor Rahul Yadav from Chennai. Hearty welcome both of you to the webinar. Now I request moderators to take over the proceedings. Over to moderators.
Thank you, Dr. Rajgopal, for introducing the topic and having Dr. Gautam Suresh to talk with us. I'll speak about a topic a little bit. We're going to be having a lecture on patient safety in NICU, a five-pronged approach. Patient safety is actually a movement which came at a turn of the last century, somewhere in 1999. The Institute of Medicine published a report, To Err is Human. And that was the first time when people started talking about deaths happening in the hospitals. And when around in that report, it was mentioned that 98,000 patients die every year in hospitals because of various medical errors. So soon it became that a lot of people looked at the NICU and realized that the NICU also has various events where serious medical errors can take place. So right, like during resuscitation or for management of various conditions such as HIE, or even maybe improper monitoring and failing to recognize hypothermia or hypoglycemia, not recognizing late preterm infants and treating them as term, and so on and so forth. As far as recognizing medication errors and various other errors that hamper patient safety in the NICU, there are ways to also prevent errors. And so people started looking at human factors, and also the fact that just having more technology is may not be always very good, because it can often increase the complexity. Medical records, electronic medical records are supposed to prevent or reduce medication errors, but many times they have found that it has not happened so. Things like task analysis, user-centered design, or system performance, and so many other things need to be looked at when we are looking at patient safety. While it is important to create a culture of safety and allow people to talk about errors that might happen, important to have incident reporting and so on and so forth. So we will have Dr. Gautam Suresh talk on various aspects of this as regards to the NICU, and I will request Dr. Rahul Yadav to please go ahead and introduce us speaker for today. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Here, my responsibility today is to introduce the speaker. Speaker is a versatile personality. The one word which I liked in his introduction is eternal learner, lifelong learner. And despite being a person who has donned many hats, out of that, a majority of them are leadership roles. One leadership role he has performed previously, that's in USA, that he was in charge of NICU in Texas Children's Hospital, Houston. After that, he has been professor of pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine. Before that, in India, when he was in India, he has done his MD and DM neonatology from Prestige Institute of PGI Chandigarh. So his area of interest are many, but out of that, three to be highlighted are evidence-based medicine, patient safety, and QA, that is quality improvement. So out of these three areas of interest, he is going to highlight today about patient safety. So this is his brief introduction. Thank you, everybody. I would like to hand over the proceedings to speaker.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. We can hear you okay.
Okay. Let me share my slides. Give me 1 second. Can you see my title slide?
Yes, sir. We can see it. We can go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to people in other parts of the world. It's a great honor for me to be speaking to all of you today, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. I would like to start by showing my disclosure slide. The first disclosure is, even though this is called a Learn from the Legend series, I don't consider myself a legend. I'm merely a senior student of neonatology, quality, and patient safety, and I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I would also like to start by thanking all my teachers and mentors and advisors from whom I have learned so much over the past many years. I have been blessed to have a long list of teachers and mentors who have interacted with me. And I thank and express my gratitude to all of them from the bottom of my heart. I want to start by framing this session and proposing a method by which all of us learn during this session and after the session. There is a saying in Sanskrit which goes like this. Acharyat padam adatte padam sishyas svamedhaya padam sabrahmacharibhyah padam kalakramena cha. 1/4 of our learning comes from the teacher, 1/4 from the student's own intellectual efforts, 1/4 from fellow students, and 1/4 eventually over time with practice and experience. Today, I will be giving you 1/4 of the knowledge that you can acquire about patient safety. And I hope during this session, you will contribute your 1/4 by paying attention, being curious, and thinking and reflecting about the points that I'm going to make. And also, I hope during the discussion, we will have 1/4 from the fellow students where people ask each other questions and share their own learnings, and we have point and counterpoint. And most importantly, over time, I hope that you will apply this knowledge and gain experiential knowledge. Because the objective for my session is not to give you a high-flown data and statistics-based talk, which will impress you. But my objective is that at the end of this session, you will commit to building or enhancing a patient safety program in your NICU or your Department of Pediatrics or your hospital, which is why today I will be focusing on a few key topics related to patient safety that are very practical and simple. You can easily apply those when you go back to your work, even today. We will not be focusing a lot on research or data or graphs or statistics. I also want to emphasize that when we talk about patient safety, it includes prevention of healthcare associated infections. This, in my mind, is the biggest patient safety threat across the world, and especially in countries like India. And as a secondary objective, I hope that many of you will listen to what we discussed today and will be stimulated to do some research on patient safety, because I think the safety challenges in India are a little different from those in other countries. And another framing statement I want to make is to use an analogy. As they said in my introduction, I was classically trained in clinical medicine with a residency in pediatrics and a DM and a fellowship in neonatology. But the traditional medical training gives us what I consider the software of medicine. So just like computers have hardware, software, and an operating system, in medicine, we have clinical knowledge and skills. For example, how do you treat RDS? When do you give surfactant? When do you intubate a baby? That to me is like the software in a computer. But for a computer to work optimally, you also need hardware and you need an operating system. So in healthcare, the hardware is the infrastructure, the staffing, the resources, equipment, which are needed for optimal patient care. And today's talk will be focused on this area called quality and safety, which is not taught really deeply in traditional medical training, but it's equally important as the clinical knowledge and skills to achieve good patient outcomes. So the area in which I have been learning and practicing for the last 25 years has been in the area of quality and safety. And part of the agenda in today's talk is also to encourage all of you to start learning skills and methods formally in the areas of quality and safety, also known as healthcare delivery science. Why is this important? It was recognized almost 25, 30 years ago in the US that there are serious quality problems in the US healthcare system. To the extent that in 2001, the Institute of Medicine from the National Academy of Sciences published a report called Crossing the Quality Chasm. And they intentionally chose the word chasm and not a gap or a deficiency because they said between the care that patients deserve and the patients actually get, and the care that patients actually get, not just lies a gap, but a chasm. So the gap is so big that you can't just call it a gap. And they said that healthcare should be safe, timely, effective, efficient, equitable, and patient-centered. So these are known as the domains of quality. Today we will be talking about safety. And safety is perhaps the most important domain because when a patient comes to us for healthcare, the least that we should be offering to that patient is a guarantee that the healthcare system will not harm the patient through medical errors or inappropriate application of knowledge or technology or techniques. So safety should be a precondition for any healthcare system, and unfortunately that is not the case. A year after the initial report, as Dr. Nimbalkar was pointing out, the Institute of Medicine also published a report called To Err is Human, where they pointed out that the number of deaths in the US from medical errors exceeds the number of deaths from motor vehicle accidents, breast cancer, and HIV/AIDS. Yet this problem was not getting the attention that it deserved. This movement kickstarted the patient safety movement in the US and across the world. And there were a lot of efforts to promote patient safety, but unfortunately, subsequent report cards over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years have shown that the improvements in patient safety have not been as great as they were hoped initially when the movement was started. So we still have a lot of work to do in this field, and that applies to India and other similar countries as well. So what are the incidents or events that we're talking about when we mention patient safety in the NICU? In 2004, I published a paper where we put up an anonymous website and asked doctors and nurses from 54 NICUs to report errors in the NICUs. And we collected over 1,200 reports of patient safety events. And these are some examples of the events that we collected. A misreporting of serum potassium as being low when it was actually very high, a tracheal perforation from an endotracheal suction catheter. A baby had a Foley catheter inserted, but the balloon was inflated in the urethra and not in the bladder, leading to a the urethral rupture. A disconnected umbilical venous catheter, intravenous administration of milk, and 10-fold decimal errors with medications. And I'm sure some of you have seen errors like this or even worse in your own hospitals and NICUs. But this was one of the early papers in patient safety. And since then, I've been working in this area, most recently in the field of diagnostic errors. And I have taught courses on patient safety for over 10 years because this is such an important topic. Here's an example of what we're talking about. This is an umbilical venous catheter that was misplaced and that led to extravasation of TPN into the baby's peritoneal cavity. And when the ascites was tapped, it yielded TPN. Umbilical venous catheters that are misplaced can also cause hepatic necrosis and cystic lesions in the liver, sometimes leading to death. And we have seen this many times in the different places that I have worked in. And there are many published reports of this as well. Nasal septal erosion from poorly managed CPAP prongs. And here's a baby who died from a PICC line eroding into the pericardial sac, causing a cardiac tamponade with TPN. I want to spend a minute and let you folks look at this X-ray. What do you see here? So most people who look at this X-ray will see the pneumothorax and the chest tubes and the chest central lines and maybe some parenchymal lung disease. But we did that too when I was caring for this baby, and all of us missed this lesion over here in the left humerus where there was a discontinuity of the bone. So this baby had a fracture, and we were so caught up in treating the pneumothorax that we missed the fracture of this baby, and even the radiologist missed it. So this is an example of a diagnostic error. And we have recently published several articles on diagnostic errors in neonatology, describing the types of errors that can occur. So this is an area that has gained recent importance because the Institute of Medicine published a report in 2015 on the importance of addressing diagnostic errors. So way back in 1968, Dr. Billy Andrews published an article that was simply known as the hand. And in that, he said, when patients come to us with illness, we certainly have to have a differential diagnosis that includes cardiorespiratory conditions, hematologic conditions, infections, and so on. But there is this sixth finger called pediatrica iatrogenica, where we have to realize that a lot of the problems that we cause for patients can be iatrogenic and induced by the healthcare system. And that finger has to be ligated and removed, just like we removed extra digits in a patient. And so this is a powerful reminder for us to always keep patient safety in mind. What is patient safety? Patient safety is freedom from accidental injury, and it involves the establishment of systems to decrease errors and intercept them when they occur. The title of this talk is a five-pronged approach to NICU safety. And here are the 5 elements that I propose that all of you try and apply in your hospitals when you go back after this talk. And we will go through each of these in detail. We should use methods to identify safety events. We should analyze significant events and learn from them. We should have programs to disclose events to the family and care for the second victims. We should be implementing safety solutions proactively as well as reactively. And also improve culture, teamwork, and leadership, because those are the ways in which you can get long-lasting benefits in safety. Let's look at each of these prongs or approaches in turn. The first thing is safety event identification. There are many ways with which you can identify patient safety events, and they're listed on this slide. We don't have time to go into all of them, but I want to highlight the safety reporting in the next slide. But before we do that, I want to point out that every time we discuss a case in rounds, every time we discuss a case in case conference or morning report, it's an opportunity to introspect about the care and see if there was some deviation from optimal care that we could have improved or done differently. And very often when we get patients referred to us from other hospitals and we're reviewing the case, we often find that the referring doctor could have done something differently. So it's easy to find fault with patients that are referred to us from other places, but we should get in the habit of introspecting in the same way about our own cases in our own hospitals. So mortality and morbidity meetings, case conferences are important forums in which you can identify safety events. So let's talk a little bit about safety event reporting. This is widespread and universal and mandated by the Joint Commission. And I'm sure the NABH accreditation also mandates this. But I think we can all do a better job of event reporting. Event reporting can be voluntary or mandatory. And there are pros and cons to each. And during the Q&A, we can have some discussions about this. It can be anonymous or identified. And if it's anonymous, then people are more willing to report events, especially if the culture of the organization is not very psychologically safe. Identified reports allow you to go back to the reporter and solicit more details about the event and get deeper into the analysis. All institutions should have clarity about which events to report. Do they want people to report risks to safety, near misses, actual errors, or only errors that cause serious harm? And good safety reporting systems require good safety culture, which means there should be a non-punitive culture that if a person reports events, they will not suffer any retaliation or punishment, especially if they report an event about themselves. Having said that, it's well known that reporting always underestimates the number of errors or safety events. So not all patients' events are reported. For example, you might have an incident where a patient gets a 10-fold overdose of a medication, but that might never make it into the reporting system, and you lose out on a valuable learning opportunity from that lack of reporting. So having a good safety culture where people feel safe about reporting and talking about safety events is a good thing, and it can lead to a high volume of reports. So if your NICU has 100 reports in a month and a NICU in another city has only 20 reports in a month, it means that your NICU probably has a better safety culture where people feel safe to report. It doesn't mean that your NICU is more dangerous and has more problems. It could just mean that you have a lower threshold and people are more willing to report events. So a high volume of reports is a good sign, but it can lead to a huge burden on leaders if they have to review every event. So there is a trade-off. It's important with reporting systems that leaders of the unit review the events and give feedback to the staff who reported them, either in an identified way or a generic way, because that reassures the staff that the reports are being reviewed and read by the leaders and that attention is being paid. So that stimulates them to commit more to patient safety and provide more reports. Whereas if they just report and it goes into a black hole and they never hear anything back again about the report that they made, then it discourages them from further reporting because they say, what's the use? I don't even know what happened to the last report that I filed. So in addition to reviewing individual events, leaders should also analyze trends and patterns. For example, if you're seeing a consistent pattern with prescription errors, then you might need to initiate a large-scale initiative to study these. If there's a pervasive theme about communication or handoffs, then it's a signal that the unit has to work systematically on improving communication or handoffs. The next element of the program is event analysis and response. Before that, we need to understand the terminology and the definitions, because once you review an event in the reporting system, you have to classify it as an error or an adverse event or a near miss so that you can appropriately triage the event. So for every decision and every action that we take during patient care, we have a plan, we have an action, and that has a consequence. An error is defined as failure of a planned action to be completed as intended, or the use of a wrong plan to achieve an aim. That is, it could be a problem with the planning or a problem with execution. In contrast, an adverse event is an injury that is caused by medical management rather than the patient's underlying condition. So this is a visual way to understand the two definitions. So errors occur much more frequently than adverse events, and many errors do not lead to harm to the patient. Those are called near misses. Some errors do result in adverse events to the patient. For example, a patient might get an overdose of a medication or an intravenous infusion of milk, or a medication that is supposed to go into the UVC can go into the UAC. and that could lead to harm to the patient, tissue necrosis or hemodynamic instability or renal failure or whatever. So that would be considered a preventable adverse event resulting from an error. But you have to remember that many errors do not lead to harm to the patient. We recently had a patient where the patient was on enoxaparin for a venous thrombosis, and the team did a lumbar puncture without realizing the baby was on enoxaparin. Fortunately, the baby did not suffer from any extra bleeding or intracranial hemorrhage or any bleeding at the site of the lumbar puncture. So that was an error which did not lead to any harm. We just lucked out. But in some situations, it might cause problems. Conversely, we can do everything right, and there could still be adverse events from the medication or the intervention or the surgery or the diagnostic test. Those are non-preventable adverse events, and those would be called as complications of care because everything was done right, but something bad still happened to the patient. So when you get a report of an event, it's important to categorize them into these buckets so that you know what you're dealing with. The other thing that I would strongly recommend all of you try to implement as soon as possible is a method of routinely debriefing all significant events. So this is something we do in our unit, and it really helps to understand events, especially in the immediate aftermath when memory is still fresh. It helps to support the team, and it's a really good form of learning for the people involved. So I would say you should aim to debrief at least 90% of significant events that occur in the unit, even if they occur at night. For this, you have to train debriefers to do the debriefing well, and I give a whole different talk on how to do debriefings. But basically, their debriefings have to be non-judgmental, non-critical. The debriefers have to be good listeners, and the focus has to be on learning and not pointing fingers or assigning blame. Debriefings can be called as hot, warm, or cold debriefings. If they're done immediately after an event, they're called hot debriefings. If they're done within a few hours or a day or two, they're known as warm debriefings. And if they're done later, much later, they're known as cold debriefings. A simple way to start debriefing is to ask 3 open-ended questions. What went well? What could have gone better? What should we do differently next time around? And debriefings should assess cognitive, technical, behavioral, and emotional aspects of the event, not just the medical complications. When you do the more in-depth analysis of events, so the debriefing is the first layer of responding to an event. A more deeper layer, which is reserved for serious events that led to patient harm or that could have led to patient harm, requires a more in-depth analysis called a systems analysis. In bad events, it's also known as a root cause analysis, but I prefer the term systems analysis. And there are many, many frameworks to do these kind of analyses. A well-known one is from the Joint Commission. Charles Vincent has published a good system. But I am proposing this simple system called the WHO system. And it's a play on words. In the old days, when an error occurred, people used to blame individuals and say, whose fault was this? Who messed up? I think we need to change the WHO to an acronym which stands for work environment, human fallibility, and the organizational context, because those are the locations where the origins of the error start. And unless you focus on those systems related factors, you will not be able to eliminate similar errors in the future. So this is the approach I propose for you to do a systems analysis in your unit when you launch a patient safety program. Work conditions, human conditions, organizational conditions. John Sanders, who's a well-known expert in the field of patient safety, pointed out that human error in medicine and the adverse events which may follow are problems of psychology and engineering, they're not of medicine. Again, this ties back to my comment about the operating systems of medicine and how we need to learn about that. So let us look at some examples of work conditions that lead to human error. Infusion pump errors are very, very common in medicine. And in our paper, we had a lot of reports and they continue to occur in spite of smart infusion pumps. So if you look at the infusion pump on top, the keyboard is very hard to read. There is no contrast between the letters and the keypad. The screen has a lot of glare. And even when there is no glare, the screen is a green screen where the digits are very hard to discern from the background of the green screen. In contrast, the infusion pump at the bottom has a large keypad with easily visible numbers, and the screen which displays the infusion rate and the numbers and the letters is larger with good contrast between the letters and the background and easier to read. So this is called the science of human factors and ergonomic design of equipment. So when you're buying equipment for your NICU and setting it up and using it, paying attention to human factors is very, very important. Here's another example of human factors and work conditions. If you have small labels that wrap around the specimen tubes and are hard to read, it's easy to mix up specimens from one patient with another patient specimen and make patient identification errors. This is an example of what's known as look-alike drugs. There are also sound-alike drugs. So if you have potassium chloride and sterile water bags that look very similar, not only that, if the way in which you store the bags is very faulty with wrong labels that don't match up with the bags, it's easy to understand why a nurse or a doctor makes an error with the infusion. There was a well-known case in Indiana in the US where 6 preterm babies got an overdose of heparin because the pharmacy technician who brought the heparin to the unit brought a vial that had 1,000 units per ml of heparin instead of 10 units per ml of heparin. So the nurses used the higher concentration vial and put it in the IV tube, IV fluids of the babies. And the babies got a severe overdose of heparin. A couple of them died, and I think 3 out of the 6 had severe intracranial hemorrhage. And the newspaper was in, the hospital was in the newspaper for months after this incident. These are photos of the CEO of the hospital at a press conference explaining how the 2 vials of different concentrations looked very similar. So it was easy to confuse one for the other. So when you're talking about systems analysis, the Swiss cheese model is a very useful framework to organize the causes and contributors to patient safety that led to a specific event. So as I said, there are error-producing conditions in the work environment, the W part of WHO, and there's human fallibility, which we'll talk about in a minute. Both of them lead to error. Organizations often have defense mechanisms, for example, double checks or checklists, or computerized cross-checking of information, or an additional person to supervise the first person. But all these defense mechanisms are flawed. They're not 100% effective. And when you put in multiple defense mechanisms, ideally, if an error occurs, you want the error to propagate to the first couple of mechanisms and then be intercepted by the intact layer of the next mechanism. Unfortunately, sometimes all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up. So the error propagates through the flaws in every layer of defense and ultimately reaches the patient. And every time I have been involved in an event analysis, the Swiss cheese mechanism holds up and has proven to be a very good organizing framework to think about how failures occurred at multiple levels of protection. Most recently, you may have seen the Swiss cheese model being applied to the COVID-19 pandemic and how failures in multiple layers of protection at a public health level, at an individual level, at a societal level, all contributed to a huge COVID surge in some countries. So the second part of the WHO model is the human fallibility. And one of the fundamental concepts of working in patient safety is to acknowledge that humans are fallible, they're not perfect, and they will make mistakes. There is no point in blaming them and punishing them, because if you don't take care of the systems issues, another human placed in the place of the first one will make the same mistake again. So human fallibility occurs because we all have limits to our cognition. Our memory, vigilance, concentration, and information processing are all subject to breakdowns and failures. Our performance degrades when we are tired and fatigued. Our workplace is full of interferences and distractions, most recently from our smartphones. And distractions make us lose our focus and concentration and make us more likely to commit errors. If we are stressed or anxious, we tend to commit more errors. Human beings have a tendency to commit violations, which is not to follow the rules. The best example is none of us follow traffic rules 100% of the time. We all break the speed limit, and we drive through an orange light, and many other examples of violations in our personal lives. And if we have biological or medical problems, like a problem with vision or a tremor, or as we age, our cognitive abilities might diminish, those predispose us to make medical errors. And in our work on diagnostic errors, so we talk a lot about cognitive biases that we can all suffer from. And I've given a whole different talk on diagnostic errors in other audiences. So when the patient safety movement was first launched, there was a lot of emphasis on not blaming individuals. But then after about 10 years, experts realized that people were blaming the system and not taking personal responsibility, even when they should. So the pendulum had swung too far from blaming individuals to blaming systems. And every time a person was involved in an error, they would shrug and say, no, it's a systems problem. I wasn't responsible. So experts proposed that we need a balance between the no blame approach and accountability. And this is one approach that many organizations are taking, called the just culture approach, where in the beginning, you assess whether this was a human error or an at-risk behavior by the clinician, or it was a reckless behavior. So if it's a reckless behavior, like somebody willfully ignored a very obvious safety precaution and went ahead with something, or somebody was intoxicated when they did a operation, or somebody did something criminal or illegal, then that is definitely a situation where they have to be punished. If there's at-risk behavior where their intentions were good, but they took a shortcut because of time pressures or some other multitasking demands on them, then you coach them and encourage a behavior change. And if it was a human error where it was an inadvertent action or a slip or a lapse or a mistake, then you console and put in place some systems interventions to prevent these. So this just culture approach balances no blame with accountability. I want to talk a little bit now about what to do after an event occurs. In the US and in most Western countries, the default is to have a frank and open disclosure conversation with the family to the extent that we know the truth. We should avoid speculation and hyper-disclosure in these conversations and only reveal what we know to be true and promise the family that we will do a more thorough investigation and get back to them with the details of what we discovered. An apology is an important component of such disclosure conversations. And 2 studies in the US have found that if you take a frank, open approach to disclosing to patients, then it may reduce the frequency of litigation. And even if there's a lawsuit, it reduces the amount of settlement. And in my experience, families have been very forgiving when you disclose errors honestly to them. And one of the greatest comforts that families derive is a method of implementing safety solutions to prevent other patients from being harmed from a similar error. Having said that, I realize that the situation in India and many other countries is very different, because there is a lot of violence against hospitals and doctors when there is a negative patient outcome, even when everything was done right. So that is one area I think we should do research on to find out how exactly disclosure should and does work in countries like India. If you want to learn more about disclosure and apology, you can go to this website in this platform called Open Pediatrics, and there's a video from me talking about how to disclose and apologize after an event. We should not forget the second victims of a serious medical error. The first victim, of course, is the patient and the family involved in the error, who may suffer serious harm and even death. But the second victim is the nurse or the physician who's involved in the event, and they can suffer severe psychological trauma and have PTSD-like symptoms for months and years following the event. I have personally been involved in a few serious errors in my career, and I can attest that the trauma stays with you for a long time, perhaps forever. Many clinicians even quit the profession because of their involvement in a bad error, and some commit suicide. This is a photograph of a nurse in Seattle who was involved in a PICU patient's care. And unfortunately, the child got an overdose of medication. I think it was calcium chloride, and died from the overdose. And this nurse was so traumatized from being involved in the way the hospital handled the event that she committed suicide. This photo is from a newspaper, and you can read about it online. So paying attention to the second victim and supporting them is also very, very important. The next thing I want to talk about is proactively implementing safety solutions and not just reactively. So safety solutions can be generic safety solutions like leadership, teamwork, communication, promoting a safety culture, and improving family members. One of the most important safety solutions, which can apply to a wide range of events, is simulation-based training. Simulation can be done to teach people invasive procedures, and we're all familiar with the simulation done for NRP training, but the same concepts and methodologies can be applied across a variety of other topics as well. So invasive procedures can, come to mind easily as a topic of simulation. But you can also do simulation on communication, including how to disclose errors to families. You can do simulations on cognitive aspects such as decision making, so you avoid diagnostic errors. You can do simulations to promote teamwork so that you strengthen the behavioral aspects of team interaction. And you can also do simulation to promote organizational safety. For example, we do simulations about NICU evacuation in case there's a natural disaster. And if there are special situations, we designed a special simulation when we had conjoined twins on how exactly the surgery would occur, how the patients would be transported to the OR, and other special aspects of caring for the conjoined twins. So organizational safety can be promoted at a high level using simulation as well. Then there are a lot of specific safety solutions that you can implement proactively. And I want to emphasize, you have to implement this proactively before a bad thing happens in your NICU. There is a saying that fools learn from their own mistakes and wise people learn from the mistakes of others. So we should all be wise and learn how to prevent mistakes before they occur in our institutions. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of all of these, but there are a lot of specific practices to prevent medication errors. For example, prescription rules that you should never write a 0 after a decimal when you're ordering a medication, but you should always write a 0 before the decimal, when you're ordering a medication. Use of tall man lettering. Avoiding verbal orders of medications. These are some things you can do to prevent medication errors. For invasive procedures and surgeries, you can do timeouts and use checklists To prevent identification errors, you use two identifiers, not the patient's bed or the patient's room. Like I said, infection prevention is probably the biggest safety priority for Indian hospitals and NICUs. And there are a lot of bundles and best practices for preventing infections. The people at St. John's Hospital in Bangalore have done a lot of good work in this area, and I worked with them on this. And we published a paper a couple of years ago showing a significant decrease in infections, healthcare associated infections in the NICU through the systematic infection prevention efforts. So I think that's one of the biggest priorities for all of us. And then wrong route infusions can be prevented through mechanical constraints. And in a sense that these mechanical constraints are the poster child for patient safety. So here's what I'm talking about. Many years ago in anesthesia, they used to have a problem where when a patient was waking up from anesthesia, the anesthesiologist by mistake would give the patient inhaled anesthetic gas such as nitrous oxide instead of giving oxygen because they would plug the tubing into the wrong outlet. So instead of reminding people or educating people or sending emails telling them to be more careful, they said, let's redesign the system. And they made it such that the oxygen tubing only plugs into the oxygen outlet and the nitrous oxide tubing only plugs into the nitrous oxide outlet. They changed the design of the outlet and the nozzle. You can see similar systems in anesthesia where the sevoflurane nozzle only fits into the sevoflurane outlet and does not fit into the isoflurane outlet. So this is the ideal way to prevent errors because you're not relying on humans and you're relying on a design to eliminate errors. In the NICU, we sometimes have problems where milk is infused intravenously. And if you look at these two syringes, one has milk and one has intralipid. And it's easy to mistake one for the other. To prevent intravenous infusion of milk, there are special feeding tubes available. Then the tubing that contains the milk has a bright orange nozzle that only fits into NG tube or an OG tube or Riles tube and does not fit into an IV tubing. So this is an example in the NICU of a mechanical constraint to prevent errors. So we're reaching the end of my talk, and then I want to do a poll to see how many of these elements are there in your NICUs. The next topic to talk about is psychological safety. And this applies to organizational culture, leadership, and the foundation of good patient safety efforts. Psychological safety is the belief that individuals can openly voice concerns and opinions, report events, and share ideas in the workplace, especially members with comparatively lower status in the group. And it's also defined as the willingness to take interpersonal risks at work, whether to admit error, ask a question, seek help, or simply say, I don't know. So unless an organization has a good level of psychological safety, you cannot make significant progress in patient safety. So creating an atmosphere where people feel safe in speaking up is crucial to all patient safety efforts. So this is the global holistic view of everything that I have talked about so far. Over here is this triangle with error facilitating conditions at the base, and that is known as the blunt end of the system. The sharp end of the system is where the doctor or the nurse are directly delivering care to the patient, and that's where the error occurs. We can have in place several defenses where even if the doctor prescribes a wrong medication, the nurse or the pharmacist double checks it and prevents it from reaching the patient, so the error never occurs. Or the error may occur because of failure of the defenses, and there may be defenses to prevent the error from translating into an adverse event. For example, if there's an IV extravasation of fluid containing calcium, we might act very quickly to inject hyaluronidase into the area and prevent ulceration and tissue necrosis. But even those defenses may fail and the patient may suffer from an adverse event. In any case, after the adverse event, it is important to do disclosure, analysis, and risk management call your the hospital risk management people and care of the second victim. And all of these, whether it's a near miss or a latent error or an error or an adverse event, should be subject to systems analysis so that you constantly learn and improve safety. And this box called culture encases the whole operation because that is fundamental to improving patient safety. So in conclusion, patient safety is important to work on. The science is still evolving, and a good NICU patient safety program involves good event detection, systems analysis, disclosure and care of the second victim, proactive implementation of safety solutions, including the family in safety solutions. We didn't talk a lot about that, but that's a different talk. And then paying attention to culture, leadership, and teamwork. So Manoj, if we can do the poll now and then go to Q&A, that would be great.
Sure, sir. We will do that now.
Shall I stop sharing my screen? So you are seeing a list of questions. Please answer yes or no for each of them. And Manoj, will you facilitate the poll?
Will do, sir. Will do.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So please respond to the poll questions.
Results of the first poll on the screen.
Yeah. So 73% of the respondents work in a hospital where there is a reporting system. That's good to hear. Next one. So next question is about analyzing events. Please respond to the question. So 67% of respondents work in hospitals or NICUs where there is a team that analyzes the most serious efforts. Very good. So this is the third question. And I also see some good questions being chatted in, which we will address during the discussion. Keep posting questions. So disclosure is occurring about 50% of the time. Okay, next question. This is about supporting the doctors and nurses involved in a serious medical error. Okay, so second victim support is occurring about 45% in the respondents' hospitals. Thank you. Couple more questions and then we'll go to Q&A. That's great. So in 89% of cases, interventions to ensure patient safety are promoted proactively. I think this is the last question about leaders. So all the leaders on the Zoom call, please pay attention to this question, because this is your area. That's great. So 87% say that the leaders welcome comments about safety, which is really encouraging to see. Okay. Yeah, one more question. Yeah, the last question, and then I think we wrap up after that. Yeah, this is about blaming individuals. Okay. So in 55% of the respondents work in places where individuals are commonly blamed. I think that's the end of the poll. So thank you for all of you who participated in the poll. And let's go to Q&A and discussion. And I know there are a lot of quality and safety experts in the audience. So I welcome your comments and thoughts too.
Dr. Gautam Suresh, it's been a pleasure listening to you for the last 45 minutes or so. And as you rightly said, patient safety is later on like a newer science or a newer concept. It's just about 2 or 3 decades old. Actually, even neonatology is maybe just 60, 70 years old. So we are still a work in progress. And you have quite very nicely explained how to go about detecting events, how to go about analyzing the various events in terms of systems, the just-in-time, the just analysis of the events, and how to go about disclosures, etc. Actually, I don't know if you know Spanish, because there was a listener who has asked for a course for this lecture in Spanish. Graciela Basi wanted the lecture in Spanish, but so that indicates how good the lecture was. The thing about labels on syringes, etc., is actually significant, because even a lot of medications that many of us take, it becomes very difficult to find out what is being written on what are the drugs that are in the medications. So it's a very interesting talk, especially the paper that you published in 2004. I read it a long time back, and it was a very interesting way to find out whether people respond. So I'll just begin with a small question from my side before we go on to questions of others. If an organization can be either flat in terms of like less hierarchical or can be a hierarchical organization. So in India, it's more likely to be an hierarchical organization. The question that we have asked, and many of them have said that they prefer reporting, etc. This is a self-selective audience, so maybe that's why it's maybe biased. But how do you look at like from the Western perspective versus the perspective in India, where it's more hierarchical, and how can we go about kind of improving organizational culture in India? So if you can speak a little bit about that, and then we can move forward.
Thank you so much. Lo siento, yo no hablo español muy bien, although I'm learning how to speak Spanish. So your question about organizational culture and the hierarchy is very important. It's a misconception that in the West, organizations are very flat. And when I started working in Australia and the US, I always used to call my seniors sir and professor, and they always used to tell me, oh, just call me Peter or just call me Roger. And things like that would make you think that it's a flat hierarchy. But in reality, a lot of organizations, even in the US, are very hierarchical and very top down, where the person on top controls everything. And I have found the opposite too. Like when I've done workshops in India and when I've spent time in units, I always used to think the professor and HOD will call all the shots and everybody else will jump when they're told to jump. But in reality, especially like when working in St. John's, I found that the team was very flat and people would be very relaxed when talking to their professor and HOD and their senior people. And there was a kind of warmth in the team. And similarly, I used to think that nurses have a lower position in the hierarchy, but in some hospitals that I've seen in the US, in India, nurses had a lot of power and a lot of say. But those are general, like blanket statements that may not apply to all institutions in all places. But the important learning point here is we have to pay attention to the hierarchy and the organizational culture when we design safety initiatives. And the solutions that we implement cannot be just borrowed from one place and implemented without customization in your hospital. You have to think how to customize and adapt for your own setting so that it matches the culture. So in hierarchical places, it'll be easy to get some things done, but then people will not speak up. And in places with a flat hierarchy, there may be a lot of autonomy, but there may be chaos. So there are trade-offs.
So as a follow-up to that question, so if somebody wants to begin a patient safety program in a hospital, can we know in advance, or is it possible to evaluate the, like what you said, as psychological safety of an organization, so we can know exactly what problems we might face as patient safety programs are put in place?
Yes, there are 2 surveys that are freely available on the web that you can use to assess organizational safety culture. One is from the AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. The other is called the SAQ, the Safety Attitudes Questionnaire, that was developed right here in Houston out of University of Texas, Houston. It was a cultural survey that was originally designed in aviation, then adapted to healthcare. So you can use those to assess organizational culture. And I think an interesting research project would be to translate the questions into local languages and ask our nurses and clinicians to answer them and assess how organizational culture differs in Indian hospitals versus other places. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rahul, can you ask a few questions from the participants?
Yeah. But, one question came about the medico-legal implications. Suppose some error happens and you put on paper that so and so overdose has happened, and worst of worst comes true that because of that this one error, adverse event happens and the patient expires. So will that writing with honesty can lead to actually further actually medical legal implications and case against the doctor or hospital was one question which has got practical significance.
Again, I am not an expert in medical legal matters in India and how writing or not writing will affect the risk of the medical legal liability. But in general, I can tell you that in other countries, the impression is that more transparency actually reduces risk. Because if a patient has died, the family will be suspicious that something wrong happened. And if you don't disclose, and then they get a hold of the chart and they look at it, it will raise more questions and more suspicion. And if a serious error led to a patient's demise, that's going to be hard to cover up. Essentially, you'll have to lie. And so there, in general, I favor more transparency and more disclosure with the belief that it reduces risk. but that might not be true in all settings in India. Like I have a close friend whose daughter-in-law underwent cesarean section in a place in South India, and they left a huge retractor inside the abdomen. And when she had ongoing pain and abdominal cramping for several months after the surgery, they did an X-ray and found the retractor. That's not the kind of thing you can hide in the chart. The thing that I would say it's okay not to write in the chart and not to disclose is if you ordered the wrong dose of a medication and the nurse checked it and found that it was wrong and you corrected the medication dose, there's no need to tell anybody about that because your defense systems worked. But if the error reaches the patient and causes harm or especially death, then I think you need to lean more towards transparency and not try to hide it. But this is an unknown field, and I think we need to work out guidelines. Maybe NNF can take this up and come up with some guidelines for disclosure while recognizing that when bad events happen to patients, doctors and hospitals are at risk of violence. So you can't be too much of a Gandhi with these kind of things.
Yeah, because the second question was also continuity of this question, whether honesty is suicidal here. Honesty, sometimes honesty, too much of honesty has led to actually attacks and all those things and negative consequences. Because of this, actually once bitten 100 times people are shy. So sometimes actually cover up culture is more prevalent than actually disclosure culture. Though the audience poll what we have conducted gives an impression that everything is good, but the ground reality is not that. So that's why another question is coming that whether the disclosure should be conditional or unconditional disclosure, means whether when patient goes down and comes up, then we disclose, or whether patient is can go down, then we disclose. Disclosure, how to select the timing of disclosure?
When you say patient goes down, what do you mean?
Means another word, suppose some drug has been given, but the side effects are not evident yet, but can happen after some time. Or this one we can disclose it proactively that this has happened and we are monitoring the side effects. Second option is patient does have side effects, comes out of it, and then you explain that yes, we had side effect and we have taken care of the side effect, and now your baby is doing well. So what should be the timing of disclosure? It should be instantaneous disclosure, or whether it should be retrospective disclosure?
I think the timing should be carefully thought out, and we should use some judgment. There's no need to be scrupulously timely, and so you don't want to do what I call hyper disclosure.
Yeah.
Because if you go in and talk to the family very early, you'll end up speculating a lot because you don't know what's going to happen to the patient and how the patient's going to turn out. So waiting for a few hours or a day or two until the trajectory of the patient becomes clear, I think is better and frankly kinder to the family too. You don't want to scare them. But rather than spending a lot of time agonizing over what to disclose and what not to disclose, the situation in India with the threat of violence against doctors emphasizes the need to prevent these errors so that you don't have to get into a situation where you disclose. So if you prevent, then you don't need to agonize over whether to write in the chart or to do a disclosure, because frankly, the stakes in a place like India are higher for patient safety for doctors.
Yes, sir. One more question is coming, is very nice question, is about that fantastic statement that majority of errors are either engineering or they are psychological. Either they are engineering type or they are mind related. So sometimes what happens is that how to distinguish between these two, because many times a lot of overlap is there. Yeah, can you give one example where engineering and mind both are possible? As a leader, how to segregate them?
So I'll give you an example. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide. It's on a different computer. We had, I've been involved in 2 errors where the computer interface misled the doctors to wrongly diagnose the patient's condition. So in one example, the computer interface was uniformly gray. So all the rows were gray. And the platelet count was reported as 180 or something, but right below that, the hematocrit was reported as 34%. So when the resident was reading the platelet count, her eye crossed a line and they read the platelet count as 34 and they gave a platelet transfusion to the baby. So there is a cognitive component where the human being was not paying close attention to reading the line, but there's also a technology and interface component. If alternate lines were shaded, dark and light, dark and light, dark and light, it would have been easy for her cognitively to stay in the same line. So better human performance through decreasing fatigue, increasing awareness, and minimizing distractions might have prevented that error. And better interface design, where shading, which is a simple technique, could have prevented the error.
Thank you, sir.
In another example, the lab reported the number of cells counted in the CSF in one cell as 189. They were not reporting the total count or the differential count per microliter or per ml. They were reporting, this is the number of cells we counted. And the people misdiagnosed meningitis, put in a central line and started antibiotics. Removing that which is completely irrelevant clinically, who wants to know how many cells were counted? That doesn't matter. So removing that line, which we did, would prevent future errors from occurring.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Gautam, there's another question. This is from Dr. Prashant Gowda. He asks, postgraduate trainees in India need training in communicating medical errors, and do trainees in USA get formal training in this regard? I have a follow-up question to that, which is mine. And that was related to the second victim, because we have had in our unit also, not in NIC, but in the PIC, we have had errors and patients have died and a resident was involved. So how can residents cope when they're involved, and how will it impact the learning the subject and practicing the subject later on? So maybe something related to postgraduates, their training, and if something happens, how do we ensure that they cope well?
Yes, thank you, Prashant, for those great questions. In the US, residents and fellows and medical students are mandated to learn some topics related to quality and safety, but it's generally mixed in with a lot of other clinical content. So I think in some cases it may take a lower priority, and patients, they may not absorb the principles. I'm editor for the Joint Commission Journal on Quality and Safety, and we're just reviewing a paper where in one hospital, they actually paid the residents to lead quality improvement initiatives. And if the initiative was successful in meeting the goals, the residents got a cash incentive for participating and sometimes leading the project. So that is one way in which hospitals are trying to incentivize participation in quality and safety. Regarding the effects on trainees, I think trainees are the most vulnerable if they're involved in a medical error. And I have seen residents and fellows really shattered when a patient died or had a serious event from a medical error. So the first thing, obviously, you have to train them on patient safety principles, and that this might happen to you one day. You have to train them not to be too eager to go talk to the family and disclose errors. Because I've had situations where the resident went to the family by themselves and started talking about the event. And ideally, we should have a team discussion and involve risk management first before talking to the family. Debriefing is one of the best methods with which to support residents and fellows. So if suppose you're putting in a chest tube and you realize that after putting in the chest tube, it went in the wrong side. The pneumothorax was on the right and you put in a chest tube on the left side. This has happened. And what you do immediately is stabilize the patient by putting in the chest tube on the correct side and removing the incorrect one. But then you should immediately have a debriefing where you put get the team together in a room and talk about the event and what happened. For example, the X-ray could have been mislabeled, or the patient could have been flipped head to toe, which got the site confused. But during the debriefing, it's important to address the emotions and the psychological distress and reassure people that they are not going to be fired, that they are not going to be punished, and also reassure them that you as the senior doctor or the senior nurse are also feeling distressed and upset. So showing vulnerability, if a leader shows vulnerability, it reassures the trainees that this is human. It's human to make mistakes, and we are all vulnerable, and we should do better next time around. You can turn it into a learning experience while supporting the resident. It's also important to follow up over the next few days and make sure they're okay.
So a follow-up to that question, as far as debriefing is concerned. So if the reporting of events is anonymous, how do we go about debriefing? And a question also is that if somebody has asked if the error is serious, how can you assure that no punishment will be done in the event of reporting? So if somebody reports, how do you go about debriefing if it is anonymous? And if it is a serious issue, as somebody might feel, then how can you ensure that no punishment can be given if it is not anonymous? So something to that effect.
Yes, so anonymity definitely comes with trade-offs, because if an anonymous report is filed, you cannot investigate further and you cannot do a good debriefing. So the debriefings that we do in our unit are identified events that occur, and the debriefing is done immediately in the aftermath. So the anonymous events, you cannot debrief unless you can track down the patient and then call the team together, because the anonymous report can signal that there was a problem. And then you can go to the patient if the patient's name is identified, review the chart, talk to the people who are on that night shift, and then pull together a team, again, making it a learning experience. When a serious harm occurs to the patient or when death occurs, again, you have to use that just culture approach. And there are algorithms by which you can assess when to find a person culpable and when to punish them and when not to punish them. So if a patient, say a resident or a fellow or a registrar was intoxicated when they came to the shift and went to a delivery, and they made a big mistake and the patient died, definitely that is a situation where they should be punished. If they did something criminal or illegal, definitely they should be punished. But if it was a human error, where it was an inadvertent mistake, or they were overloaded with a number of patients and they could not pay attention to every single thing because the workload was too much, and something bad happens, that is a situation where you should not blame the individual, and you should still turn it into a learning experience, because the individual is blaming himself or herself as it is. They are punishing themselves much more than you can ever punish them. And you can still turn those into learning events. And I've been involved in many, many incidents where bad things happen to patients, but we still did not blame individuals, we supported them. But we put in place mechanisms to prevent the same thing from happening to a different patient.
Okay, so Dr. Rahul, can you ask a few questions more?
Yeah, one question came about the role of clinical pharmacist. This clinical pharmacist and infection control nurse, these are the two individuals. Whenever they enter the NICU team, the sisters and residents, they consider them as an outsider. Somebody who is observing, going through charts as an outsider and reporting and all. They are treated like spies, sort of spies. And the leader is in two minds, whether to go by their reporting or whether to be loyal to your own team. So as a leader, sometimes we feel getting torn into two conflicting emotions. Sometimes if you the infection control sisters reporting and clinical pharmacy reporting, if you go in micro details, our team gets actually nervous. And if you don't pay attention to their findings and all, their enthusiasm goes down after some time till one big event happens. So how to make balance between those who are working and those who are monitoring individuals and working individuals? How to have balance between these two individuals?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Thank you to whoever asked it. We face that same dynamic here in the US too. I think the best approach is to make those people part of your team
Okay.
and make them feel embedded within your team, while recognizing that their loyalties might be split between you and the hospital's quality department. Because the hospital quality department is more worried about NABH accreditation, and they don't want to be in the newspaper, and they don't want to be fined for any violations. So they're operating from fear. And you're trying to create a learning environment where you learn from events and improve safety. And you have to feel a little sympathy for those people, because they're trying to serve two masters, and they're trying to go to a foreign country and function there while not being welcomed by the team.
Yes.
So what we do is we actually socialize with those people. We invite them to our parties. We learn their names, and we build a personal connection with them. And that way they give favorable reports. Basically, you want the hospital administration and the quality department to say, NICU is in good hands. They know how to run their own ship. We trust them, and we'll just help them whatever they need. We're not going to micromanage them. You want to create that dynamic.
Okay.
Then they can worry about, the operating room and the outpatient units. And they can say, I don't need to worry about NICU, because NICU has owned quality and safety, and they will take care of it. And, Lisa will just support them.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question. You talked about just culture, and this kind of comes where you looked at punishing people who did some criminal behavior, etc. So it is possible that suppose I'm leading a unit and a neonatal unit, and suppose who will be the judge of that event? Because it is possible that the people involved might have some conflicts of interest, or some other interest might be there. So how do we go about ensuring that a just culture kind of is appropriate, and the people who are taking the decisions are not taking it from personal vendetta or some other way, because it can happen in various places and we don't know. How do you ensure a just culture in a unit? How do you, who are the masters doing the judging? How do you know that they're going to be correct?
Well, again, that is a issue of organizational culture and psychological safety and trust. And what you're describing exists even in the US, where all these mechanisms for reporting and investigating can sometimes be misused against you if people have personal agendas and there are power struggles. So sometimes hospitals can be a jungle with a lot of danger and a lot of politics and threats. And safety has to be managed as a high priority. It all comes down to leadership. So if the hospital leaders and the NICU leaders are aligned and they all agree that safety comes first and politics and personal agendas should be put aside, then I think you have a rich environment for learning and promotion of patient safety. One thing that you can immediately use is that it's in everybody's benefit to have a safe patient care. So everybody's risk is reduced. But if people have a personal vendetta or a personal agenda against you or somebody else, and they use a safety event to kind of undermine you or take you down, then that's an opportunity for higher leadership to intervene and have an open discussion about the culture of the organization and the department. And I have worked in places, including in India, where there would be 3 or 4 different consultants, and each of them was waiting to catch the other and undermine them. That's a toxic culture. And ultimately, the person in charge should ensure that the toxic culture is eliminated and the people are professional and collegial. I know it's idealistic, but that's the only thing I can think of. It ultimately comes down to good leadership.
So just following up, there's I think you have maybe answered it a little bit, but we'll still look at it. Dr. Subhash Shaw is asking the question, disclosures may be perceived to be dangerous in view of medical legal consequences, and how to instill this culture when it is feared. And as a follow-up to that question, I have a question, because you talked about errors and you talk about adverse events, and at a certain region they intersect. Now, when you disclose something, whether it's an error or an adverse event, the patient may not realize the difference. While we have an idea of what is the difference, the patient may not realize the difference. So how will it impact, and especially in an Indian scenario, how do you think this might play out?
I think everywhere, including in India, anytime there's an adverse event, it is likely to be automatically misinterpreted as an error. So something bad happened, so the doctor must have made a mistake. That's nature, that's human nature and human psychology. But to avoid that, I think you need good informed consent at the beginning, where you explain clearly to the patient, this is what we're going to do, this is what you can expect. In some cases, even when we do everything correctly, you may have this complication or this problem. And then update them as the event unfolds to say that everything happened as planned, but unfortunately, this complication occurred. And that's the best you can hope for. But again, I feel like I'm giving advice in terra incognito, because I think the Indian experts and the Indian clinicians have to get together with the legal experts in the country and come up with some good guidelines on how to reduce medical legal liability for doctors and hospitals. One thing I can say is, whenever I've done a disclosure conversation with the family, I say two things to them. The first thing is, I say, we will be completely open and transparent with you. We will not try to hide anything, and we will tell you whatever we know. The second thing I say is, you have 100% complete access to the medical records of the child. So anytime you want, you have to go to the informatics department, health information department, and they will give you photocopies of the chart. All you need to do is fill out a form. And that one fact that they have access to the chart reassures them. But again, that's a US-based practice. I think the guidelines for all this about disclosure, documentation, medical legal risk have to be developed locally for India and customized by high-level organizations.
Yeah, Dr. Rahul, can
Yeah. Yeah, well, one question came from my friend, Dr. Vishwanath Kamoji. He's a passionate man, like majority of us. And he
Yes,
went,
I know Vishwanath, yeah.
yeah, so he went to one round, then ET was displaced. He told people that you have to fix ET properly. Again, after some time, again, same error was happening. Again, this time by different sister, different set of caregivers. So again, he putting DOP on warmer and incubator. Despite putting on DOP big letters, same error is happening again and again, because people work in shifts. You tell one set of sisters, those sisters are not there next time, or some sisters leave and new sisters are coming up. So in this situation, we have to be patient, actually, ideally. But being a passionate leader, usually we tend to be angry. So how to handle our own anger and how to streamline the things?
First of all, you can extubate the baby, put the
Yeah.
baby on CPAP. That will eliminate the problem.
Yeah.
Second thing, this might indicate that you need to work on handoffs from one team to another, and improving the handoff system might be a good solution here. The third thing is, there is no role for anger, because anger only serves to alienate people, and it doesn't result in any productive results. So those are some tips. And what I would encourage is, in a situation like this, raising awareness by having a good team discussion and ensuring that there's good handoffs. And this brings up an important concept that James Reason, who's a world famous expert on patient safety, used to emphasize. He said, attacking individual problems at the bedside, or one clinician telling one nurse to do X, Y, or Z, it's like swatting mosquitoes one at a time.
Okay.
So instead of killing one mosquito at a time, you should go to the swamp where the mosquitoes are breeding and eliminate the swamp. And
Fantastic.
then the mosquitoes will stop attacking and biting you. So put some, anti-mosquito.
Yeah.
Use Odomos.
Yeah. Got it, sir.
So that you don't have to kill the mosquitoes and kill the breeding grounds of the safety problems.
Dr. Suresh, I have questions related to evidence and safety. You talked about two things. One is reporting of safety events, and second, you talked about simulation-based training for patient safety. My question is whether has reporting safety events on a regular basis improved patient safety in hospitals? Is there any evidence overall for this? And whether processes have changed in NICUs for those NICUs which have shown higher reporting, and including whether if feedback was given. So something related to simulation and whether it has shown to improve patient safety by training, and whether reporting also has improved patient safety over a period of time. Is there any publications related to this?
I'm not aware of any high quality evidence showing that introduction of reporting led to decreased errors and greater safety. It's just something that has been adopted in the US healthcare system and in the West. And a lot of it came from aviation and transportation industries. Because in aviation, almost 40 years ago, they realized that pilots will make errors because they're human. They said blaming pilots for airline crashes is not going to eliminate the crashes. We need to work on better design of the plane, better communication, and team training in the cockpit called crew resource management. So healthcare has kind of adopted similar concepts, and that has been known as translocation of practices from one industry to another, rather than evidence-based practices. So I can't say that there is a randomized trial where 100 units were randomized to reporting and 100 were not, and the former group led to better safety. And that's a general problem with quality and safety in general, that the level of evidence is not always high. So we have to use judgment and kind of clinical wisdom.
We have crossed 9 o'clock, which is the normal time, but we have a lot of questions coming. But Dr. Jalil Ahmed is wanting us to ask this question. He is repeatedly asked. So I think he wants us to ask you, if at birth, time of birth and sex announcement from the healthcare worker went wrong, how to tackle the situation? I have actually faced it, but I think you can maybe take the question and I will share my experience later. So basically what happened, a boy is born and you say girl, and maybe a girl is born and you say boy, and you realize later on that there was a mistake. How does one go about doing that?
So I think there you can easily be transparent and say, I apologize, I made a mistake. And I'm reassuring you that there was no switch of the baby, because this nurse and this resident and this obstetrician was there at the delivery. And you can take all of them with you to the delivery room. But the more important question will be, why did this happen? Why would the gender of the baby be wrongly informed? Any thoughts?
No, it happened to my resident, and it was just by mistake that he did. So some delivery happened around 5:36 in the evening, and this thing came to light around 1 hour later when the baby was handed over. So we were doing a research project during that point of time where we were recording the management of the baby. And so we had videos of that particular baby in which we could make out what was the sex of the baby that was. So we were able to show the relatives the videos, but this like from 7:30 to almost 11:30 in the night, 4 hours, me and the person from quality were discussing with the relatives for almost 4 hours. So then they even threatened to put a suit, go to police. So because we had the videos and we knew that we had not made a mistake, we could say, and we showed them the videos. But it was a really tense 4 to 5 hours. And I think it is just a mistake that the residents might make at that point of time. It is not, it is just maybe again, cognitive overload, or the person must not have slept or something like that. So it is just totally unintentional, but it can be a problem. It does happen.
Yeah, so I think that's an example of an error that caused you a lot of distress and a lot of unnecessary hassle for 4 hours, upset the family. And that can be easily prevented. And I would say, I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here, maybe you should have a policy that nobody should announce the sex of the baby until 2 people have confirmed. Or you only announce the sex of the baby after showing the baby to the family. Something like that. I'm just kind of, I need to understand more about why this happened. Or maybe people are not doing a good physical exam, or maybe the lighting is poor. And we've had babies where an imperforate anus was missed and the baby was handed to the family as a normal baby. So we need to figure out why this happened and eliminate the error. And in this case, there was no physical harm to the baby, just suspicion and lack of trust.
Yeah, in this
So I
case,
think,
Dr. Asha
proven-
Pankaj mentioned that baby boy died, but the hospital handed over a girl baby or something like that. So things like that can happen. Actually, this is a problem more in large delivery centers where there are like multiple deliveries that are happening, and there is a often thing that baby might have been exchanged, or these things are worrisome in large delivery centers. There are quite a few more questions. I don't know whether we should go on, but I will ask maybe rapidly. I'll ask a few questions, then maybe we can. So one is besides hand hygiene, Dr. Rajan Ketarpal asks, besides hand hygiene, what do you think is the next most important practice to prevent hospital-acquired infections, specifically in Indian scenario?
proper care of IV lines, including peripheral IVs. I'll give short, brief answers.
Yeah. Then second, he again asks, behavioral and psychological makeup of persons and organization is very important for quality and safety. It's a big task. Some suggestions in this. I think you have spoken on this, correct?
Team training, leadership training, and working actively on organizational culture.
Dr. Vijay Kumar Guduru is asking, a departmental inquiry to fix an accountability when an alleged negligent safety issue occurs should be given up, or how to start with brief steps.
That's too complex a question for me to answer quickly.
So I can share what happens in a hospital. So we have what is called as incident reporting. It is part of NABH. So if I want something to get something to be brought out, then we do an incident report. An actual meeting is held of the department and the quality, and like it's a big team meeting where everything gets discussed. And because of that, some things are actually changed. So it does happen. People still may not do the change because I think some of my quality team are still looking at this video. But it is a workable plan is kind of done. There are many more questions. I will ask very fast. Dr. Partha Sathi is asking how important it is to have organizational psychologists in hospitals.
Very important.
Next question. Dr. Pankaj Gar says, in a hospital, one nurse was fired as the parents video recorded her nap on a night duty. So what do you think that is?
That seems a bit extreme, but I don't know the situation. So I hate to comment on whether that was appropriate or not.
Yes, Dr. Rajiv Kumar asks, how to build a second victim support program as part of a patient safety culture in NICU and PICU?
There are published articles on this. It basically means having a number that the clinician can call, training the people who provide support, having some mental health professionals, and having referral mechanisms for people who are experiencing serious or ongoing distress.
Okay.
And leadership support.
Another thing, Dr. Ashok Kumar asks, how do you handle a resident doctor who commits errors repeatedly?
You have to first assess, do they have any neurocognitive problem or physical problem? And then if it's a problem of lack of knowledge or education, you try to coach them. And then you go through an escalating approach where you take progressively serious interventions. And if they really have a problem that cannot be corrected, then they may have to find a job in a different institution or go work for a electronic health records company or something related to medicine. But in a lot of cases, you can educate them, train them, or fix their biologic problems, like they may just need glasses if they can't see properly.
Yeah, so I have had a resident who had such issues and is actually doing extremely well in an academic fashion now. I think I'll ask two more questions. Can you comment, Dr. Vinod Bansal asked, can you comment on writing guidelines for a procedure and then a team has to go outside the guideline and something goes wrong and the team is held accountable?
I think when you deviate from the guideline, you should write in the medical record your reason for why you want to do things outside the guideline. What's the justification? So clearly explain your reasoning. That often is the best mechanism.
Okay, Dr. Rahul, maybe one or two questions and then we can wind up.
No, I think my side is okay. This one over this one.
Yeah, back to the question on the gender of the patient. I think a good habit is to have the identification band ready before the baby is born. And as soon as the baby is born, put the ID band on with the name baby of Sarala or something like that. So that you immediately, as you put the pulse oximeter and as you wipe the baby, just put the ID band on. That way it reduces the confusion.
As far as this is concerned, gender is concerned, this one we actually tried to dissect that problem. We found that actually the gender disclosure problem happens with mostly IMRs, sweepers. In many hospitals, the sweepers and sisters, those who announce the sex of the baby outside, they get paid 50 rupees, 100 rupees immediately by the happy family. And they are told that boy is born and ultimately lands with a girl. So that they get angry. So boy-girl confusion, when we analyze, it was predominantly because of corruption by the sweepers. This one, the sweepers, they go out and declare before doctor. And doctor, even if he tells something, they won't believe on the doctor. This is the commonest problem, especially in government hospitals. Second thing, what we observed is hypertrophied clitoris and the labia minora, labia majora, different fats. Some are fatty, some are less fats because of IUGR. Some confusion happens by the sisters or IMRs, and they announce. So if you go to the root cause analysis, usually this problem can be solved. And second problem we found is that the tremendous importance being given to the gender. Even if the baby is on requires bag and mask and all those things, in spite of knowing the baby's condition, they keep on asking what is the boy or girl. And sometimes in that hurry, doctor ends up blurting out boy or girl. So it is more of a, as you said, it is more of related with mind, like corruption or overwork. So this particular thing can be addressed actually quite well, depending on volume and understanding of biology. This one.
So when I did my residency, I that was not the main thing. So many times I remember in my first posting, relatives used to ask me whether it's boy or girl, and I used to tell them like I actually didn't check. I need to go and second check. But like when I initially started, because you don't think it's very important, but then as you grow, as you mature, you realize that it's something which is very important. You should not miss. And Dr. Suresh, it has been an extremely interesting session. I think we have had at least more than 1 hour of questions and answers. There are quite a few questions left unanswered, but I guess we could go on discussing and learning. But we need to call it a day. And thank you for joining. And I'm sure you have to go to the hospital now. And
so I'm happy to come back to do more teaching whenever you invite me. So thank you all for your attention and your engagement and interest.
I will hand over to Dr. Vishnu for the final comments. Thank you very much, NNF Kerala, for the opportunity for me and Dr. Rahul to moderate this session. It has been interesting because especially I have had 2 papers which are not published in medication errors. Maybe we can talk about it sometime. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So all good things have to come to an end. So respected seniors and my dear friends, on behalf of NNF Kerala and Team IAP Neocon 2021, I thank respected speaker, Professor Dr. Gautam Suresh, for that enlightening lecture and wonderful discussion. Thank you, sir, from the bottom of our hearts. I also thank our dear moderators, both great academicians in themselves, Professor Dr. Somshekhar Nimbalkar and Professor Dr. Rahul Yadav, for moderating the sessions wonderfully well today and for that great discussions. Thank you, sirs. Last but not the least, I thank our dear delegates, more than 2,500 delegates from more than 65 countries all over the globe. Thank you for your active participation and making our webinar series a great success. So our next webinar is scheduled on 23rd of December at 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. The webinar will be on using technology to protect brains in resource-limited settings. The lecture will be delivered by Professor Dr. Gabriel T. Varian, is the founder of Protecting Brains and Saving Futures. He is also the medical director of Neuro and ICU, Santa Casa, Sao Paulo, Brazil. So welcome all of you for the next webinar, again on 23rd December, 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you all for joining us today, and wish you all a very good night. Thank you. Thank you, sir.